Alright, so welcome back to the project. We are going to actually start building out the data layer of our application layer now. So just like we had some separation of concerns at the application architecture level, we will also have some separation of concerns in the form of separate projects within our application layer itself. So we're in the Solar Coffee solution, and we have created these four separate projects, if you will. We have a data project, which is a class library. This will actually be responsible for handling the data models that we create. And we're going to be using a tool called Entity Framework for that, specifically Entity Framework Core. So Entity Framework Core is an object relational mapper, and all an ORM is really a tool to handle the translation, if you will, of data that we define in one piece of software to another piece of software. So Entity Framework in this case is an ORM that handles taking C# models and translating them into some persistent store like SQL, for instance. So in SQL, we'll have tables for each of the models that we create. And in C# we're dealing with classes. So we're thinking more in terms of objects here in the software layer, in the in the application layer. But in the data layer down below in Postgres, everything is really represented on disk in the form of tables. So we'll have tables that represent models, and those tables will have columns that represent properties on models. And then each row, if you think about it, is sort of like an instance. So in a sense, that translates to an instance of any model that we create. Again, if that is something that is new to you, that's all right. This is going to become much more clear as we start fleshing out the Solar Coffee data project. So to actually start working on this, we need to add some NuGet packages. And I can show you how to do that here in Rider. It's going to be very similar in Visual Studio. And if you're not using either of those IDEs, I'll also show you how to do it from the terminal in just a moment. NuGet is .NET's package manager, and it allows us to add packages from a global package manager system that is just online and actually bring those dependencies into the projects that we're working on. So ASP.NET Core Entity Framework is one of them, and we can get that from ASP.NET Core. Actually, we're going to use .identity.entity framework core. Identity is basically identity.entity framework core basically adds some functionality for creating identity models on our tables. We will talk about that a bit later, but that gives us the ability to ultimately have things like users and their claims if we want to actually manage users of our system. So if you've heard of things like OpenID Connect or OAuth, OAuth 2.0 in particular, then this is sort of in the realm of Microsoft ASP.NET Core Identity Entity Framework Core. Okay, I'm also going to add the Microsoft ASP.NET Core Identity package itself. So I'm using version 2.2 in this case. I believe it was version 3.1.1 for the identity.entity framework core. And then I'm going to add Microsoft.entity framework core. And you're definitely going to want to make sure that you're checking the names of these packages as you install them. There are many packages on NuGet, and you just want to make sure that you are installing what you think you're installing. Finally, I'm going to add a package called npgsql .entity framework core.postgresql. And as you can probably guess from the name here, this package is going to give us some Postgres functionality with Entity Framework Core. So there are many different types of databases we can use with Entity Framework Core, at least a handful of them, and one of them is Postgres. Okay, so I can see that we have these packages installed here. So we just have 4 NuGet dependencies. Now I'd like to show you how to install them from the terminal in case you're not using an IDE. So if you head over to NuGet.org, you can actually search for packages by name, And so you just search for those 4 packages that we just installed, and then you can see that they give you the command for using the .NET CLI for installing them as well. So you can run this from the terminal, and you're just going to want to make sure that you're in the data project. And then if you were to run this .NET add package with the version, in my case, it's already going to be added, but you can see that it is adding that package to this particular project. Okay, while we're here at the terminal, the next thing that I'd like to do more or less right away is get set up with Git. So it's going to be useful for us to track the code that we're writing in version control. If you haven't used Git before, we're going to just use it in a very simple way to just keep track of our work on a single branch. And we're going to push the changes that we make to a remote repository, and that can be on GitHub or GitLab or Bitbucket, really wherever you'd like to host your remote. We're going to host this remote on GitHub, but feel free to use a remote of your choice. So the first thing that I'm going to do is actually cd into our front end directory. And I believe when we set this up, depending on how you set it up, you may or may not have created this as a Git repo. And what I'm going to do is run the command rm-rf.git. Otherwise, if you're in a file explorer, you can actually delete this directory by selecting it and deleting it. If you don't see it, then it may be hidden, and so make sure you can view hidden files. If you're on a Unix-based machine, then you can run ls-a essentially, and that will show you dot files, your hidden files. We just want to make sure that we delete the Git repository that was created in our front end directory. The reason for that is otherwise Git is going to probably try to treat this front end directory as a Git submodule, and we just want like the simplest possible Git setup right now. We don't want to deal with things like submodules. They're not super complex, but they can get that way, and yeah, we just want to track these as individual directories. All right, so to start a Git repo, we just run git init. We can see that it's initialized an empty Git repository in this directory. And then what I'm going to do is create a file called .gitignore. And I'm going to use Vim for this, but feel free to use a text editor of your choice. We want to make sure that we create this in the root of our project directory. And a gitignore file is essentially just a file that says, hey Git, I don't want to track the files that I have listed in my gitignore. Oops, and we want this to be node modules. And so on each line, I'm just going to define some file that I'm really not interested in tracking. So this is a Mac thing. Node modules, ignoring that's going to be useful when we are working on the JavaScript side of things. This workspace.xml is something that sometimes comes from my IDE. Likewise, I'm going to ignore binaries and object directories that are created by .NET, and I'm going to also ignore Visual Studio and idea.files. This is again from just various IDEs or text editors. Okay, if we run git status now, you should see that it's going to start tracking all of our directories and our gitignore file. So if we run git add -a and then run git status again, you can see that it's added all of these files, and now we are tracking them. So it's actually staged them, and we can make our first commit. So we're going to use git commit -m to provide a message, and I'm going to call this message initial commit. I do have some aliases for my git commands. So if you see me run git a, that's running git add -a. If you see me running git c and then just some commit here, that's running git commit -m, and git pu for me is git push. These can actually be configured in your git config. And so you can see there's my git config. So if I'm talking and running git commands that aren't working for you, it's just because I have some aliases set up. You can set up aliases on your machine as well. All right, we don't have a remote, which means we can't push our changes anywhere. So I'm going to set up a new repo on GitHub so we can push our changes. If you do have a GitHub account, you can create a new repository by going to github.com/new. And in my case, I'm going to create a new repo called